Hi again, everybody, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. And I hope you've been well. In our last episode, we talked about how this idea of Platonic love or the Platonic relationship that a lot of us seem to have today is, or seems to be, unfortunately, quite different from the idea that Plato had of love, from his teachings of on love in 4th century BC Athens. And I talked about how this is really kind of unfortunate because um, it means that very few people today are aware of the transformative potential of his teaching, its potential to really make our lives better. So before I really get into Plato's own teaching, though, I thought I should talk a bit more about the problem that it's trying to solve, because you can't really understand the solution unless you have a good notion of what the problem is. So we'll sort of have to go, in a way, we'll have to go down before we go up. So I think the problem that Plato's trying to address is really, um, you could call it the fundamental problem of being human. Um, of course, humans are animals, so we share a lot of the same problems that other animals have related to survival and reproduction. But I think there's also a problem that's unique to humankind and universal across human experience, I think. And that's existential alienation, um, the sense of being cut off from the world and cut off from ourselves. And it may sound kind of abstract, something that doesn't really play a big role in our day to day lives and is maybe even kind of a first world problem. But I think it's actually very important. And it has been always through human history, I think. So, as I said, it's uniquely human and universal to humankind. And that's because it comes with a territory. It's sort of the other side of the coin of something that's also, I think, unique to humans and universal to humans, and that's thinking. Um, I think most of us would recognize that what seems to set us apart most of all from other animals is this capacity of abstract thinking or reasoning. And this has been, I think, kind of universally recognized. Nowadays, we have this term to describe the scientific term Homo sapiens, or sapiens, as the Latinists would say, to describe our species. And in the Middle Ages, they had this concept of humanity as the rational animal. But I think there are all sorts of other myths and legends that are getting at the same idea, stories in which humanity is in some ways apart from the rest of nature. So we're talking about this special kind of cognition that came to be in our remote ancestors. And uh, while I certainly think it's a fascinating question, how and why, and exactly when it came to be, I think we won't be able to get into it in this episode. But somehow what happened is that our ancestors came to be able to create objects of thought, ideas or concepts. And the essence of this really is in the mental act of abstraction. Abstraction comes from this Latin verb meaning to pull or drag away. Pull away, drag away. That's also where we get the word tractor from, the same Latin root verb. And when we're abstracting, it's fitting, because when we're abstracting, we're pulling content away from where it is in the stream of life and grouping it into these fixed things, these things we call concepts or ideas. So in a way, when when we abstract, we're necessarily taking things out of context and um, making our own creations out of what's in nature that we can then recombine in these various ways. And that's what thinking is. So obviously, there's a huge evolutionary advantage in this because when our ancestors learned to think, they could make plans and they could share their knowledge with each other. And then there's also something that tends to get passed over, I think, when this development is talked about in a scientific way, in an objective way. Because there's also this whole subjective side of this development, which was that it meant a whole new way of being, a distinctly human kind of being. It meant, I think, a really sort of indescribable change in our experience of life because we went from being organisms that had this immediate relationship with nature, with our surrounding world, to being subjects standing apart from the sea of objects, either physical objects or objects of our own thought. Um, and it gave us a kind of almost, as I said, it's sort of indescribable, but you could call it almost a kind of godlike perspective on the world, which along with which there comes a kind of existential thrill, because it's up to us. We have the power to make these universal judgments about the world, um, and this is, you can see that this is really what's being talked about in the book of Genesis, when after Adam and Eve eat of the tree of knowledge, God says that um, humanity has now, quote, become like us, unquote. And it's interesting, of course, to think about why the word is us rather than me, whether that meant that he was talking to a host of angels, or perhaps maybe this passage is so old that it comes from a pre-monotheistic phase of Judaism, and he's talking maybe to other gods. Anyway, this new way of being in the world has there's a unique sense of thrill to it, but it doesn't come without a price. This this separation, the subject-object relationship we now have with the world, also causes a unique kind of suffering. Before, the world used to be this garden in which we all fit harmoniously. Of course, we suffered and died, but we didn't have the capacity of thinking. We didn't know we would die, so we didn't have the same kind of despair we have now. It's as though nature held us so closely to herself that we couldn't see her. We were her. Now we stand apart from nature, and nature is an it. And nature also now seems indifferent to us. Nature doesn't care, in a way. Nature is indifferent to our thinking and planning. And as such, the world can seem like a radically other, perhaps even hostile place. It's a world that requires us to die despite all the planning, despite all our plans, and the sense we have of control. But existential alienation is about more than just our relationship with external nature. It's also about our relationship with our internal nature. The mind, the ego, the thinking self has to translate the world, but that the world also includes the world is everything that just presents itself. to the mind, to the ego, and that includes our inner nature, our feelings. We have to interpret them and use them to try to determine a course of action. Now, there are times when we seem nicely in sync with ourselves, but I think part of human nature is again the sense that we're living alongside of something that is a radical other. This sense that our inner nature, not just outer nature, but our inner nature, may be in a way indifferent to the thinking mind. It may be this purely irrational thing that just has its own agenda. And so when we talk about existential alienation, we're really talking about this universal problem of seeming to have a divided self. And that's been expressed in all these different ways through history, through, you could say, the clash of reason and passion, or the rational and the irrational in human nature, or more recently, the ego and the id. So the downside of thinking is that it can create this sense of radical apartness. You might say it's a kind of loneliness on an existential level. And I think most of the time this is something that lingers unnoticed in the back of our minds, but it can break to the surface in ways that are really troubling. And that's what I'll be talking about next time, along with some of the hope that Plato brings to this universal problem. So I hope you'll join me then, and thanks for joining me today.